You want to introduce yourself, David?
Oh, I heard you pause, so I thought that was my
No,
introduction.
go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm David Harrison. I taught for many years, taught public policy at University of Washington, and did considerable work with nonprofits as well. Since 2016, I've had a blog project. My blog on political matters goes to a couple thousand people, so it's been very heartening. And it's called Our Unfinished Work. I should warn people that since several of you are not in my usual Friday crowd that Karen and I have worked with for 5 months or so now, that I started out thinking that I would need to be attentive to people on all parts of the political continuum. But my Friday crowd is all people who are basically, we're not Trump supporters and are, for the most part, Biden supporters. So I'm going to talk like one of those. And I love expressions of differing opinions, so don't be shy about that. My custom also is, as Karen mentioned, is to stop, and I will stop 4 times for us to discuss. So just to give you a headline, I'm going to start with, and we go about an hour with questions, comments, insights, thoughts, and insults from you folks. So first, I will talk a little bit about how Biden is doing in general. Then I will talk about the pandemic and where that's going with Biden. Third, Congress and everything that's happening there and isn't going to happen because of the 60-vote rule in the Senate. And then I'll end up with political advocacy and Trump's racist speech of sorts. And then we'll be done. So if there are not any concerns about that, I will get going. It's a good time to take stock for those of you who were obsessed by the 2020 elections, and I know several of you were. Don Rooks is there, so I know at least one of you was obsessed by the 2020 election. Things seem to be pretty calm, and that, of course, is because Trump's not on Twitter or Facebook, so he doesn't have his natural audience, and he's really disinterested in infrastructure and energy policy. As he showed the other day, he just wants to talk about the big lie. So it kind of decreases the number of times he's going to pipe up. He also, of course, has some pretty significant financial problems, and he may well be indicted soon. I think that's created a lull among Biden supporters, which is pretty scary. The reason why Biden won by 7 million votes and the Democrats tied or took the majority in the Senate is because people who were advocates campaigned all the way from 2016 to 2020. It was a huge movement. You may or may not remember that in December 2016, the Democratic Party itself was dispirited and pretty much absent. And it was then that that Indivisible and other organizations started pumping the issue of taking back the democracy. So that's, now we seem to be in a little bit of a lull in terms of politics, but it's very interesting to watch what Biden's doing. If there ever was a man with a plan, clearly he thought about this, and there's been all sorts of talk in political analyses about the first 100 days and the first 300 days. By the early fall, everybody in the Senate and the House is going to be thinking about the next election. And Biden is trying to get everything done legislatively that he can get done between now and, other than the budget, between now and the fall. And of course, he did it with a plan. He decided, you may remember, there was a big discussion in September about whether there would be ongoing battles between so-called progressives and so-called liberals. I always said I'm not so sure
They can see
what
us.
that even means, but because so many issues don't divide in that way. But at any rate, Biden, for the most part, has resolved that by having huge proposals. So as you'll see with infrastructure, he's willing to scale them back too. But the American Rescue Plan, the stimulus package, and the, I'm forgetting my nomenclature, and then the subsequent huge package that included the child poverty package, and his pandemic efforts have defined the Biden presidency as a very large presidency with big, almost New Deal-like proposals, and that has pretty much thinned out the Democrats, the liberals versus progressives. His plan is to do something, to do a lot right away. For all the talk about what a jerk McConnell is, they have approved almost all of his appointments, and they did it quicker than has normally happened. So that has been a good thing and has made it more possible for him to act quickly on things that agencies do. So that's why he's issued a ton of executive orders, including undoing pretty much everything that Trump did with executive orders on the environment. We've got somebody who's not muted. If you could mute yourself, that would be good, because you're coming in on us. You see, legislatively, and I'll get to that, we're talking about the infrastructure bill now, but what you see is Biden trying to get as much done legislatively as he can, given that there's a rule for most legislation, as you know, that unless it's subject to budget reconciliation that only takes 50 votes, that you need 60 votes in the Senate to close off debate. And that's why a lot of things that Democrats yearn for are not going to happen. That's not all bad for Biden, because of course, when he or somebody, when they do the Senate races next year and the presidential race 3 years after that, they want to argue that they count in the lives of the center of American politics. So he's not, I mean, obviously he would like to pass more legislatively, including the election reform law, the For the People Act, but he's feeling pretty good that his approval ratings are above 60%. And he knows that there's a lot he can get done on the non-legislative side. Quite notably, the G7, the 7 largest industrial economies, have just supported Biden's idea of a minimum corporate tax. I'll get to that a little bit more later, but that's an example of something he can get done. And of course, he's re-embraced NATO, and of course, he's back to trying to re-establish the Iran agreement. And of course, he's all in on re-establishing the Paris Climate Accords. So as you know, being president is not just about passing legislation, and it's a good thing because he's got some real constraints in that front. So I'm going to head toward the pandemic, but let's stop there and think about where he stands and why, and see if there are any questions or thoughts on that.
Please unmute yourself if you have a question or a thought, please.
I can move forward if you know.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, a lot of people are talking about the filibuster and,
So I can go back to that. Nancy, did you have a question?
Yeah, and I was just going to ask that, like, if we got rid of the filibuster, the electorate, well, okay. I don't believe the electorate would be, everything seems to be premised on getting elected these days. We're no longer talking about anything except like how to get elected. And that's motivating a whole lot of what's going on. So, but in my opinion, the electorate doesn't care about whether we have a filibuster or not. So I don't think the Democrats would lose getting elected if they just redid whatever it takes to get rid of the filibuster, or to put it on hold, or to cause it to have indigestion, or leg cramps. I don't care what they have to do to it, but get it temporarily shelved or something.
So I'm an uncommon Democrat because I'm going to say why I don't think that's a good idea. But to go over what you said, it is certainly true that if elected officials were always thinking about reelected, they're certainly more transparent about it now. It seems to be higher. There are things that Congress does that we don't hear about that are heavily politicized and that are in fact bipartisan, but a bigger percentage of things are now that way, and there's constant attacks, and part of that is, of course, Fox News makes money. They monetize the daily aggressive, untrue accusations in American politics. Anyway, with regard to the filibuster, as we all know, it takes 60 votes on most things to close debate on the Senate. And when we're not in power, including the 4 years Trump was president, that was awfully useful. So what Nancy's saying is we could change that to 50 votes without suffering monumental political harm. I think that's right. I think we could win next year and still have used the nuclear option against the filibuster. The problem is you'd have to have 50 votes plus Kamala Harris to change the rules, and we don't have 50 votes because Joe Manchin and probably Kristen Sinema of Arizona and maybe a couple of others aren't for it. What they're for is threatening to do it to try and get a little bit more cooperation on something like an infrastructure bill. The reason why I'm not for changing it is because I'm not convinced we'll stay in power. And I do not want everything that Joe Biden does in the next 14 months to be undone by us not having 50 votes. I would guess that we'll have 54, 55. I really think next year will go well, but I'm not willing to take the risk.
Okay.
What people say, of course, is, David Harrison, you're crazy, because don't you know that climate, in particular, climate change could kill our planet, and we have to get going. And I agree with that. I just think that Biden has an enormous amount of things he can do on climate without changing something that, even if they could get Manchin's vote, would imperil us in the future.
Okay, thank you. You're encouraging me because you're pointing out what he can do without having to worry about the filibuster. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions before I move forward about more thoughts on the pandemic?
Yeah, I was just wondering, because I feel like, we have these lines that we think would never be crossed, and McConnell has crossed so many of them already. My fear is that, okay, we hold back and we don't get rid of the filibuster, but as soon as McConnell gets a chance, he does it. I don't know. Do you think that's a risk? Or, I mean, maybe he's afraid of the Democrats getting back in power too, but I don't know. There's just.
McConnell has his own Joe Manchin, and so we'll see what happens to Lisa Murkowski in the next election. But Susan Collins was just elected for 6 years on the argument that is not fully persuasive that she's been a moderate. I think she's not been as helpful as she could have been. But there are several Republicans that would like to keep the present situation for pretty much the same reason that I would. They'd like being able to have it when they're not in power. So I think if the worst happens and they get 52 senators or so, they'd be hard pressed. I wrote in my blog about the 6 races that we're most likely to get, and we have a more favorable map than they do.
Okay.
There are retiring senators, Republican senators in Iowa, looks like Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, and Rubio's in a little trouble in Florida. So the argument is that we could get up to 53 or 54. Of course, that'll be interesting because back to Nancy's thought, because if we get to 54, Joe Manchin is no longer the second vice president that he is today. Any other questions before I proceed? So I wanted to talk about the pandemic a little bit. One thing that is amazing, if you're a student of American governmental and political history, is the fact that Donald Trump hasn't got credit for the #1 good thing he did when he was president. Now, you could argue that he might have been mindless about it or not had much on a day-to-day basis to do it, but we did actually invent a vaccine and expedite it at colossal speed that has perhaps saved some of our lives. So this is not inconsequential. How did it turn out that he gets no credit for that besides being not a commendable person? And the reason for that is because he himself could not take credit for it without making the pandemic sound more serious than he wanted it to sound. He was very worried about the economy not coming back. He saw the economy as an uptick, as a huge achievement, even though it had upticked for 8 years under Obama. And so he didn't want to say, guess what, I saved your life, because on the other side of his mouth, he was saying it wasn't going to kill you. So he was stuck. And that's a good thing, because as we get to herd immunity, or pretty close to it, up towards 70% of people having 2 vaccinations, the person who's going to get credit for ending the pandemic is Joe Biden, and Americans, of course. But I'm just saying, when you poll in November, if we're down to very few new cases, basically just cases between people who aren't vaccinated, when you poll, 70% of Americans will give the governmental credit to Biden. So that's a nice thing. And I think the denialism is still surprising, and Fox and Trump fed that. I think you'll also see now in the next 2 months, we have ordered many more vaccines than we need. You'll see Biden trying to use it as a tool to be a major international player on vaccines, where we own the rights to further Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, and we will utilize 800 or 600 million doses internationally. So I'll stop there for questions, thoughts, and concerns about the pandemic.
Anybody?
So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Congress. I would also repeat what I said before. It's a little misleading, because I worked there for 7, 8 years, and in the worst of days, there's bipartisan thinking that you don't see. But I would also argue that Mitch McConnell alone has made Congress worse. I think the number of, I was talking a little bit to Derek Kilmer about this with regard to the House, and he says the biggest single thing with the Republican Party is the number of people who get elected by pledging not to deal with the Derek Kilmers of the world. So that makes it really hard. If you've got 200, 210 Republicans, and half of them have been on the stump saying that the moderate Derek Kilmer is evil, then you've got a problem in terms of passing legislation. So that really has been an issue. But what's happening is there will be an infrastructure bill, a bipartisan infrastructure bill, as Trump promised there would be too, and wasn't able to deliver. The reason for that is back to what Nancy and I were talking about, and that is you would need the nuclear option to pass the infrastructure bill without it being subject to budget reconciliation, where you need 50 votes. The parliamentarian is making it a little bit complicated to use the 50 vote plan, and Manchin is not for the 50 vote plan, and we won't get a crossover Republican for the 50 vote plan because McConnell would draw and quarter him. So that's why Biden started with $2 trillion. And he also started with things that you would never see in an infrastructure bill, including $400 billion for home health care, which, given that I'm 73, I don't think it's such a bad idea. But Biden started with things that he knew he was going to have to give up. And the reason why you know there's going to be a bill is Shelley Moore Capito, the Republican senator from West Virginia, who serves with Manchin from West Virginia, has been detailed by McConnell. Is not upset that she's over there negotiating. He knows all about it. And they need 10 senators. And she's sitting there talking to Joe Biden about how to get 10 senators. The funny thing, of course, is now it's going to be down to $1 trillion or $1.2 trillion. And we got a couple of progressives the other day saying, what? Only $1 trillion? It's only like the second or third largest bill in American history. But the difference between $1 trillion and $2 trillion is not so much what is done on bridges, highways, roads, wastewater, drinking water, and so forth, but what else is in. And what isn't in that Joe Biden really wants is more money for green energy. And reprehensibly, it's not necessarily going to be there. And it's not even more likely to be there because Shelley Moore Capito is from one of our few coal mining states. So Biden will get $1 trillion, $1.2 trillion, and he'll be able to say that he passed a bipartisan bill because it will take 10 Republicans, and Shelley Capito has them. The other thing to remember about this is to do that, Biden walked away from something that he won't walk away from forever, and that is corporate taxes.
Mhm.
When Trump and his minions have passed the tax bill, they sucked up to America's corporations and to America's very wealthy people. The thing about that is that any revision of the tax bill would be subject to reconciliation. So they need 50 votes. Joe Manchin would play in some way about that. And so we're going to get some traction going forward on tax policy. Also because when they passed the tax law, they let individual tax rates that they established expire in 2025. So it has to be taken up again. So Biden didn't get an increase in corporate taxes he's not going to in the infrastructure bill. But meanwhile, Janet Yellen was meeting with the 7 industrialized nations, most industrialized nations, and they have a deal for a 15% corporate minimum. As you know, some of our richest corporations don't pay anything. So Biden will turn that prospective deal with the G7 around and try and work with the Senate Republicans on a 15% corporate minimum. So that's the infrastructure bill. It's going to be bridges, highways, roads, transit systems, water treatment. And that's not a bad thing. It's just not going to include so much in terms of clean energy, and maybe not so much in terms of broadband, and certainly nothing to do with home health care.
Yeah.
Too bad.
About any of that? Is that more than you ever wanted to know? Infrastructure bills, who knew that we would care? But we should, because America's at risk and it's crumbling, and you like to be able to drive across bridges that aren't going to fall into the water. In terms of what else,
Yesterday-
go ahead.
Yesterday, I was listening to Condoleezza Rice talking about how, the ransomware has able to get into the meat production and oil production. And she sort of insinuated that she thinks maybe the internet should be part of our infrastructure plan as a federal program in order for security. I thought that was interesting.
I don't know how, I mean, right now, it's not proven that a stronger federal role in the internet would give us that security, since they get hacked too. But I think at minimum, Congress will think of something to do with regard to ransomware. Jennifer Granholm, who's Energy Secretary, proposed legislation that we forbid companies from paying ransomware. And the only problem with that is if they get hacked and their systems get frozen, and they do say they're an oil pipeline in the east, and we can't unlock the oil, and you don't want them to pay ransomware, you're going to pay $4 gas or $5 gas and take, a point off your GDP because you didn't pay ransomware. I think they'd be better off forbidding paying ransomware after they make a little bit more progress on preventing the hacks. But
Exactly.
so there's that. They might do something this session on that. Also, what they won't do, they won't pass the For the People Act on election reform. We're going to have to continue to fight that in the states, which hasn't been too bad, with the major exceptions of Florida and Texas.
Right.
There's not going to pass a Dreamer Act. They're in an in-between stage where the reason Biden wouldn't want to pass a Dreamer Act all by himself is that's the only thing that brings Republicans to the table on immigration reform. So that's why that hasn't happened as an independent piece of legislation.
Yes.
So that's the way it's shaping up for the year. That we'll have to pass a budget, appropriations bills and budget modifications, and they'll start on taxes, all back to Nancy's point, all back to only needing 50 votes for those because they're subject to reconciliation.
Right. Hey, Rita, did you have something to say?
I was gonna just say something about the ransomware. The cyber attacks. I found it interesting that especially the guy, I think from the Atlanta hospital, said, well, we would go back and we would hope that we would have good backups. It seems to me that a lot of these larger companies don't want to really take the time or the money to really be sure that they have good backups, so that they don't have to be up. The company my son-in-law works for, an aerospace design company, got hacked, and within 4 hours they were back up because
Right.
they had awesome backups.
Yeah.
So, and I've heard that on more than one occasion. Well, we hope we have good backups. And I'm thinking to myself, what kind of management do we have, especially like in public hospitals, even private hospitals, and a lot of these things that is not a priority as part of their risk assessment, and whoever their risk manager is for that company, that is a priority. That's just my thought about that.
Hey, Rita, you want to run for Congress? Because that's so logical. It is
I know.
so logical.
Isn't that I know, it's just
That's
crazy.
very good, Rita.
Hey,
I think you're right. All I would say is one minor quibble is, I think you're right that companies, especially smaller companies and nonprofit hospitals and so forth, are under investing in the technology to operate, as they're more vulnerable than they need to be. All I would say is, in addition to that, the technology for breaking through defenses has escalated to, and the number of people who want to do it, because past ransomware has been, ransoms have been paid. So the motivation and the technology are moving along too. You're still right that we're not nearly as armed and as protected as we could be. And, you know, the Biden's executive order is pushing companies in that direction. So we'll get a little improvement, but we're still very vulnerable.
Yeah.
Other questions on this year's legislative agenda, Nancy?
What do you think the odds are? How good are Biden's chances for translating Janet Yeltsin's 15%, you know, the corporate global thing into a domestic program?
I think they're good. I think she undoubtedly, because this is a consultative presidency, talked to key Republicans even before she did the G7 negotiations. It's a little bit more palatable to them because it doesn't change their overall movement of the corporate tax rate from 28% to 21% or whatever, something like that, what they did. So you can fool around with a minimum without them feeling that they're rescinding Trump's awful tax bill. So that would, the other issue is those corporate profits for Apple, Amazon, and Google and so forth are so enormous that it heightens the motivation. Republicans like to run on things like that too. So I think it's certainly possible, especially since every member in Congress likes to say they built the bridge. So infrastructure is a very popular thing to pass.
Do they still honestly like to say that anymore? I mean, I remember that they always used to, it was pork, you know, we used to like get fed up sometimes with how many, sometimes states, you know, got too much, but are they really thinking about their constituents still, honestly, do you think?
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
6 or 8 years ago, earmarks they stopped doing specific earmarks. Back years ago when I worked for Maria Cantwell, we were in the minority and we made a list of things that we would like, and it was entertaining. But yes, Congress, members of Congress still know which bridges are deficient. It's just the noise about everything else crowds that out. They'll be heading to Dubuque the moment the law is passed. What's different is because when you let the United States Department of Transportation rate the bridges and fix them in order, then the congressman can't brag about the earmark. I like that. Members of Congress would like to be able to push things out of order, which just gets you an improved bridge that wasn't as in serious trouble as much as the other bridge. So there is some talk about bringing earmarks back because it helps people work across the aisle. I hope they don't. I think it's a bad idea. Other questions?
No.
So it's now 12:06. I'm going to head toward politics.
Okay.
So the other day, oh, wait a minute, I will say there is one thing that is likely to happen between now and fall, and that is a bill inexplicably on policing. For all the talk about what we have or haven't done since the killing of George Floyd, there's been a tremendous amount of state and local activity on what is permissible use of force. The holdup in the national bill is over qualified immunity. So the extent to which the police officer can be sued individually for his actions if they're like they were in Minnesota and some other places. The reason why I think there's going to be a bill there is the only black senator in the United States, Tim Scott of South Carolina, has been appointed by McConnell to negotiate on behalf of Republicans, and he's
Ah.
negotiating with Cory Booker. I think that's so visible that they're doing that they'll cut a deal on qualified immunity and pass something at the federal level. It might be mostly about training and such, but I do think that there will be a law by fall on policing in America. So moving on to politics, in the remaining time we have left, Donald Trump gave a speech to the North Carolina Republican Party, 90 minutes, standing ovation, which only goes to prove that somewhere in America there are some very foolish people, because he's bored with everything but the big lie, and we hear new things about the big lie. So now, we're supposed to believe that he won, and then he's holding out hope that he can do the Arizona recount process, where they're looking at Maricopa County ballots, is still discredited and still underway, and won't change anything. And Donald Trump has been talking to people about being restored to power by August. You don't need to worry about that. It's not going to happen. But the other thing that happened is there was a disclosure after Bill Barr left as Attorney General. As you know, for all his misdeeds, he was not willing to have the Justice Department investigate election fraud in December, January, alleged election fraud. And the acting Attorney General got several notes from Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, including ask him to look at the Italian military conspiracy to change our votes, which is a new one. I didn't know that. I wasn't involved in that conspiracy. So I think Trump has lost it. And of course, he still has a stranglehold. So there's got to be some Republican operatives that are sad about that. And there was some talk the other day that maybe you don't have to be a member of Congress to be Speaker of the House. So there was some talk about maybe he should announce himself to be Speaker of the House. If you're a praying person, pray for that. That would be so wonderful to have that be the Republican plank for next fall. It would ensure that Nancy Pelosi is the next speaker. So hope for that. In the meantime, we still need to do something about the big lie. And my favorite thing, Tom Kilbane's not on the line, my favorite thing is give Liz Cheney money. You'd think that would be crazy, because Liz Cheney is really, on a lot of things, is to the right of Donald Trump. However, America knows that she's running next year, and America knows that Trump is out to get her. So the biggest war chest that she can possibly get is the best war chest you would want her to have. There is a new organization of Republicans fighting back that's organized in a different way and has 150 former elected officials, governors, and congressmen. You could check that out. If you email me or email Karen, she can give you my email and I can send you the link. I don't have it right this moment. So there's things you can do to fight the big lie. The biggest thing, of course, is watching the lawsuits against Dominion, the people who make the voting machines, because Dominion is suing all sorts of Trump aides, including to Sidney Powell. And the testimony on that will be delicious, because she's already testified in her defense that we were not to be taking her claims seriously. So
Unbelievable.
that
Unbelievable.
can't be slander or libel that caused damages to Dominion, because we should have known that they weren't valid claims. So that's to watch. The other thing to watch politically, as you know, is Donald Trump could get indicted by the Southern Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance, who is Cy Vance's son. and he's not running for reelection. He's done in November. The grand jury has been impaneled. They have the stuff that tax records that Trump didn't want them to have, hundreds of thousands of pages. And if he gets indicted, it will be for devaluing his properties for taxation and upvaluing those same properties for collateral for loans and so forth, which would be tax fraud. And
That's a felony, right?
yeah, it is. They might just charge his number one business manager. The issue is if you're the number one business manager, how long are you willing to spend in jail to not implicate Trump? So you could see an indictment. That'd be interesting. That's the most likely indictment, although Georgia is still thinking about whether to charge him for interfering in feloniously in that election. So I think the strategy, I have one more thing to say and then we'll see if there are other questions and then we'll be done. I think the strategy is to understand that we have rung up significant leads among women, among college graduates, among people of ethnicity, and to expand those leads. Much was made about how the gap in the Latino vote closed. That's only true in Florida, where Cuban Americans went for Trump. We won 2/3 of the Hispanic vote. So we need to continue to maintain those leads, and it doesn't hurt to run to have our president be seen as the most empathetic person in America. It really helps because people want a president who's rooting for him, and they believe Joe Biden is. And the reason they believe he is because he is. So the thing to do, I think, is not fall asleep on this. And to the extent that you were rabid in July of last year, recapture that rabidity pretty soon, because it's only 18 months till election. Start following who these candidates are. It's very interesting to see the Democratic primaries underway. Pretty soon, people like Swing Left will have district escrow funds where you can start donating if you can find some money under the pillow. And the only other thing I would say is we still have a glitch, and that is in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, we didn't win by all that much, and we won by someone who's long been a champion of the manufacturing workers, Joe Biden. We're a little vulnerable there because those manufacturing workers still are not so sure the Democratic Party has their interests in mind, even though every time Republicans pass a tax bill, they get ignored. And it's something we need to continue to work on. It'll be very interesting to see who runs in those states. Tim Ryan, who's a longtime U.S. representative, is running in Ohio, and he's the working man's candidate. We need to continue to watch this because, as you remember, I mean, a lot of other things happened, like Comey's final statement and Putin, but the firewall did not hold in 2016, and we don't want that to happen again. We certainly don't want it to happen because manufacturing workers think that we're indifferent to their needs. And that is my thinking for today. Do we have questions or thoughts?
Let's see, Rita.
I was watching one of the news programs yesterday morning, and Corey Lewandowski was on there, and he's heading a super PAC. Now that makes me a little uneasy, just because he's about as crooked as Trump is. But
although he also said that the election was over, which is interesting. So Trump won't return his calls for a week. He said we won.
I know, but I know, but just the fact that he's head of a super PAC for Republicans, I think we really need to keep our eye on the ball.
Yeah, I think that's true. And we need to, as long as money is the
Right.
unfortunate mother's milk of politics, we have to have super PACs too. And we did pretty well in the direct giving in 2020 and the super PACs. So part of that was because Trump's campaign manager, Brad Parscale, spent a lot of money early. He was trying to define Trump in such a way that he was on that Biden's task would be insurmountable. So Trump was underfunded during the last 2 months. I think we would have won anyway, but it was helpful. And it was also helpful, as I said, that he boxed himself in on the pandemic.
Yeah.
I agree that Lewandowski is an awful person.
Bonnie and Lawrence, you have a question?
Well, when you're talking about the manufacturing people, do they not remember that Republicans were willing to just let them go under, and it was Obama that saved General Motors? And I'm kind of at a loss on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm from Michigan, and I, in fact, one time worked for the moderate governor of Michigan, Bill Milliken, who followed George Romney. So and I ran a Democratic congressional campaign back there. What I would say is a couple of things are happening. Yes, they don't remember that Obama saved General Motors, or don't credit existing Democrats, except Biden, for that. They would never give Cory Booker or Kamala Harris credit, even though they voted for it and worked on it. I think a couple other things are happening. I think manufacturing workers tend to, they have an underlying conservatism to them. And I think the Democratic social agenda is problematic for a lot of manufacturing workers, and we're not going to walk away from it. So we're not going to say, no, we're sorry that we've made America more open for multiple ethnicities and sexual preferences and so forth. So that's going to have to be a problem. But I do think that this is a scary thing for me to say, but here goes. I do think that Al Gore, John Kerry, and Hillary Clinton were not people that you would have thought would be comfortable with corn on the cob and brisket in your backyard.
Yeah, right.
You're right.
Don Rooks.
Don, yeah.
Yeah, I'm really pleased to be able to join this presentation, and thanks very much, David. I'm really interested in the what came out late last week, or maybe it was even on Saturday, that the controller of the Trump organization has been ensnared in the investigation. And what do you think the likelihood is that if he flips, then Weisselberg will flip, and the whole thing propping Trump up will just, implode?
It could. So the first issue is whether the prosecutor would think that if these folks flip, whether there's a provable case that Trump knew he was doing these things, or even and I think they think yes. I think it's just a matter of building a case. The issue of flippiness has to do with how much you personally would like to avoid going to state prison, which is even worse. I mean, there are federal prisons are not a walk in the park, but they're better than state prisons. And sure, you would get careful treatment, but nobody wants to go to prison. And these folks, the controller who's number 2 and Weisberg who's number 1, are in their 60s or 70s. So that would make you want to flip quite a bit. And Trump's not there to pardon them now. Joe Biden's not going to pardon him. So I think the chances that somebody, Michael Cohen, of course, said somebody would flip, and I think they will. It's pretty hard to go to prison for somebody else. It's hard enough to go for yourself. So I think the chances are good. I think if Trump gets charged with a felony, I don't think a judge would necessarily jail Donald Trump. I think it would be good for the continuing deterioration of his hold on America. I think actually it'd be a good thing if he ran as a felon or not 3 years from now, because I don't think he would have a chance to win. He's getting older, he's out of shape, and he's an idiot.
Well, my recollection is that Weisselberg is well into his 70s, and so he doesn't have all that much time left. But the controller, and I can't remember his Irish name, but he's younger. I think he's in his 60s.
Yeah.
So if he were to go to prison, he would be investing a fair chunk of the remainder of his life in prison, and that's why I think he would be a good one to flip.
Yeah, that's great, and he could flip on both Weisberg and Trump. So so he's senior enough that he's undoubtedly got the goods. It's a non-trivial matter to decide to go to prison. I know a couple people who have gone to prison, and they did not have a good time.
No.
Thanks very much.
No, present company included. I have not included. I haven't been there.
If Donald Trump becomes a felon, he could be run for president.
I
You can't
forgot
even
that. That's
vote.
right. You can't. Is that right? Any felony disqualifies you?
Yeah.
I don't even know. You think I would know that?
Well, no, it's okay. No, I'm just,
I've been hankering for him to do it. Maybe
I
somebody
know.
on this call knows.
Yeah. I think there's only certain felonies that disqualify you, but
Yeah. So we can check that, pick it
yeah,
up.
we can
next time
check
we're
that. That's
talking.
true. Bonnie?
Um,
Yeah.
This is Lawrence. What do you think is going to happen to Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz in the future?
Well, I think Marjorie Taylor Greene could get reelected. That's a 70% race, but I think Matt Gaetz, the guy he was associating with, could flip on him. So I don't think it's out of the question that Matt Gaetz is facing a sex trafficking charge or something like that. That would be nice. So I think they're both reelectable in their districts. They're, political personalities. Neither of them has any influence on legislation. But that'd be true of Ted Cruz too. Now, there's nobody in the Republican Senate that Republican senators are less interested in hearing from than Ted Cruz. They might even be more interested in hearing from Matt Gaetz. I mean, it's that bad. They think he's a self-serving person.
Nobody likes him.
Yeah.
Why ever would they think that? Other questions before we go?
Anybody else?
It's been good to talk to all of you folks. We'll be back hopefully on Friday next time we're together,
Yes, next month.
next month in
Yes.
July. And we'll just keep on doing this as long as you keep on showing the bad judgment of doing it.